Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Rina Turber from the IEC Central Office in Geneva. I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar today on part 2 of the ISO IEC Directives. Our speaker today is Alistair Menzies, Editing and Document Preparation Manager at the IEC. His presentation will last about 20 minutes, and during the presentation, participants will be on listen mode only to avoid background noise. After the presentation, we will have a 10-minute question and answer session, but you can already send me your questions through the chat function at any time from now onward. So Alistair, I now hand it over to you.
Thanks, Rina. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, and thanks for signing up for this webinar. We've had quite a lot of success, and there are a lot of people, there are even people on the waiting list, so I hope we're going to be able to present something to you which will be of interest. Maybe just to introduce myself, so I'm Alistair Menzies, so I'm the Editing and Document Preparation Manager here at the IEC. I'm in charge of a team of 17 people who deal with the content of standards. So we've got editors, people in charge of figures, people in charge of layout, etc. I'm also in charge of the processes and rules, or more precisely, the application of the processes and rules which are laid out by documents such as the ISO IEC Directives Part 2. So it's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to talk to you about this. Looking at the people who've signed up, I see there's a wide range and a wide spectrum of people. So I hope my presentation will be of interest to as many of you as possible. But we have to realize that there are some people who will be very experienced or less experienced who might have follow-up questions afterwards. So I welcome any of those. As Rina said, you can ask any questions via chat, and we'll reserve 10 minutes at the end of this presentation to look at some of the questions. Depending on the amount of questions, we'll see what we're able to deal with. Otherwise, we'll deal with them later on. Right, so just a little overview of what we'll be looking at today. The ISO IEC Directives Part 2, which are the principles and rules for the structure and drafting of ISO and IEC documents. We want to have a look at what does this document apply to, what its objectives are, who creates these rules. We're going to have a little guided tour through the document, as well as a few keys to a successful IEC publication. And then I'm going to have a look at a few of what I call the cornerstone principles. So it's a very high-level overview. This document is probably too complex to deal with in 20 minutes on a detailed level, which is why I want to focus on some of the cornerstone principles, which will hopefully be of use to you in your work as standardizers and users of standards. So, if we look at the scope of the ISO IEC Directives Part 2, it applies to all standards type documents. So international standards, technical specifications, publicly available specifications. Documents which are written in the style of standards and which are there for use in standardization. It also applies to other subsets of IEC publications, such as technical reports and guides, to a certain extent as far as possible. But the primary focus is for standards type documents. And when I say that it's used in the IEC, we also have to recognize that this document is used by many other standards development organizations. So as is indicated in the name of the document, it's also a basic document for the world of ISO. They use it too. And there are other national and regional organizations which either directly use ISO IEC Directives Part 2 or use a modified version of it. So there are many people around through the world who use it. We need to look at why do we need these drafting rules. It's a good question, and I think part of the answer comes when we start to analyze who we are and what we're doing and what we publish. So if we look at our output per year, the IEC publishes about 600 documents a year, and we maintain a catalog of over 7,000 publications. ISO, regional and national bodies publish and maintain thousands of these standards too. These standards are developed in a wide range of applications by a wide range of people. And all of these standards are highly interdependent. There are many cross-references across documents. There are many documents which call upon other elements of other documents and which have the same target audience. So international standards are highly interdependent. And we've got tens of thousands of experts who participate in standardization efforts worldwide. So when we consider that, we have to think what would happen if we didn't have an ISO IEC Directives document. Even though we work with a wide diversity of very qualified people, if everyone was left to their own devices, we would very soon run into trouble, and we would suffer in terms of efficiency and interoperability. So the ISO IEC Directives Part 2 exists for a certain amount of exists to ensure a certain amount of things. On the one hand, we want to be as efficient as possible in writing standards. So with common work methods for experts, this means that the experts can focus on the technical content itself. Experts shouldn't have to think too much about how they want to present things, how they want to deal with normative references, and so on and so forth. Once an expert knows how to use ISO IEC Directives Part 2, writing standards becomes easier, and then they're able to focus on the technical content itself. That's what technical experts are there for, after all. We want to make things as easy as possible for standards users. So standards users need some form of common understanding. So with common methods, we want to facilitate ease of use. Another aspect is interoperability. Standards need to be able to work together, so we need to be able to write them in the same way. Clarity and understanding. So we need common language and conventions across the board in order to ensure that we're saying the same thing using the same words. And lastly, this is one which we often neglect, translatability. Standards are translated into many different languages, and the translator needs to know exactly what each keyword means. So having a fixed set of conventions allows standards to be translated more efficiently and quicker and with greater accuracy. So the principles and rules for drafting documents, which are found in the ISO IEC directives, provide a common language and methodology for the standards world. And it ensures a clear and unambiguous documents are produced for standards users throughout the world. It's important to state at this point that it's not a style guide. We're not there to say the purpose of the directives is not to say you must use this font or that font, or we want you to underline things in this way or that way. It's a higher level document than that. The style in which a standard is published is dependent on the publishing house. In the IEC, we will have one style, ISO will have another style, etc., etc. So, who writes the directives Part 2? The directives Part 2 are not a random set of rules which are pulled out by a few people here in Geneva. The ISO-IEC Joint Directives Maintenance Team, the JDMT, is a group of people. So it consists of experts from both ISO and IEC communities, national committees, technical committees, and other experts. And they get together to consider any maintenance items on ISO-IEC Directives Part 2. So they'll receive items for consideration either from standards users or from the management bodies of both the ISO and IEC, and any changes which they propose are put up for final approval by both the IEC and ISO management before a new edition of the document can come out. So it's a relatively stable document. It's been around for about more than 30 years, and we're at edition 7 now. The previous edition came out in 2016. So now let's have a look at this document. If we open up the table of contents and we glance through it, we'll see that there are 5 major sections which are of interest to you, the writers of standards. With those are the general principles, subdivisions of the documents, the components of the text, policy, and annexes. And we'll have a look at these in greater detail later on. But before I do so, I also want to highlight another element of the structure of the document, and that concerns the fact that for the actual entries within the text itself, we have tried to ensure that we have a very similar structure in every single entry. We want to be able to say why a particular element exists, what kind of content it can contain, where it should be in the document, as well as outline a few specific rules and principles concerning that particular element. We try, for the sake of readability, to have the same structure as far as possible throughout the document. So now let's go back to our guided tour of the document itself. So if we look at the general principles, so the general principles really provide the very strong basis for standardization in general, dealing and at a very high level. So dealing with the objectives of standardization, the principles, the subdivision of subject matter, verbal forms for expression of provisions, and other aspects linked to language, units, referencing, etc. It's an important part of the document, and it contains many of the cornerstone principles, which I'm going to talk about later on. The second major section, which is of interest to you, is subdivisions of the document. So this deals with the major subdivisions of the document, what their purpose is, where they appear and in what order, as well as specific rules which are linked to them. We also try in this particular area to provide examples and illustrations of how things should be written. We give both examples of things which are right and which are wrong. Here we've got an example which is taken from the section on terminology, which lays out the various elements of a terminological entry with a few bits of commentary. So the title, the foreword, the introduction, scope, normative references, and all of these major sections are covered in this section of the directives. Next major section is the components of the text. So these are textual components which can exist anywhere within the standard, the common elements in a certain sense. And again, we lay out the purpose for these elements and the rules, as well as examples. For example, here we've got something linked to figures, and we will lay out the various elements again in such a way that it's useful for you. Next section is one linked to policy. So we're dealing here with aspects either of a legal nature or which deal with the actual system of standardization. So patent rights, use of trade names, copyright, aspects linked to conformity assessment, quality management systems, etc. If we take an example here, under trade names and trademarks, we will lay out when you can use a trade name, how you should use it if you use it, and the kind of disclaimers that should be associated with the use of a trade name, as is given here in the this example. And the last section, which is also of interest for standards writers, is the annexes. So the annexes provide us a certain amount of information which can really be of interest to you. And two which I think are of particular interest are a checklist for writers and editors of documents. Once you've written a document, or if you're about to start a document, we provide a checklist of the kind of things that people should be looking at. And it's a good exercise to look at that and to go through it at various points during the drafting process. We've got another section on quantities and units, which can always be useful. It provides an extract of the rules which are given in the ISO and IEC 80,000 series. So there you have it. All of these major sections of the directives have been described to you now, and I think those of you who are interested should then go over to the actual document itself and start leafing through it, just to familiarize yourself with the structure that's behind all of this, and to know where the various elements exist so that you can refer to them when you need them in the course of the drafting exercise. So, assuming that you are going to start a drafting exercise, what are the keys to a successful IEC publication, which you have to keep in the back of your mind? And this might seem extremely simplistic at a certain level, but I think it's well worth reminding yourself and anyone else who works in your working group with you what these principles are. First of all, your document has to be technically correct. That's your job after all. You do your best to come up with something which is technically correct. That can seem very obvious, but it's a basic expectation for everyone. Next, it has to represent the consensus of opinion at the time it was published. One of our key roles is establishing consensus. Experts get together, confront their different perspectives, and come up with some form of consensus. It has to be written in a precise and simple style. We have to remember that the people who are reading standards do not necessarily speak English, on the one hand, and that on the other hand, standards are very often translated. So in order to make the understanding of standard as easy as possible, it has to be written in a precise and simple style. Next thing, qualified people who have not participated in the drafting have to be able to understand it. This is very important and it's very often overlooked. You are not writing for yourselves. Well, you might be, but you are also writing for people who are not in the room with you. So, so the way the document is written has to be written in such a way that a qualified person can understand it even without having participated in the discussion. And then lastly, users have to be able to determine whether a product, process, system, or whatever it is you're standardizing conforms to its requirements. Requirements have to be written in such a way that they can be tested, in such a way that you can tell whether or not something conforms to that requirement. So using sentences such as "it shall be sufficiently big" or "it shall be sufficiently beautiful" or things like that, which are very subjective, should not be part of your text. We have to write in as precise and simple style is key. Okay, so let us now look at a few of these cornerstone principles of the ISO IEC Directives Part 2. So the General Principles section provides the basic foundation for the writing of IEC publications. We saw this earlier on, and whilst we can't look at all of these principles, I would like to look at a few of them. So look at the structure, conventions for the expression of provisions, normative references, and common terminology and graphical symbols. We'll have a look at a few of these in the remaining time that we have. So the IEC Directives Part 2 stipulates that all documents have to have a fixed structure, and so a certain amount of elements are obligatory and have to appear in a fixed order. So each element can contain a specific type of content. Some elements are mandatory even if they are empty. For example, the normative references clause is of interest even if it contains no normative references. Next thing, if we look at language and conventions for the expression of provisions, language, as we all know, is subject to many different interpretations, which is why conventions for the expression of provisions exist, even though they don't necessarily correspond to natural language. So we've put together a few conventions for the expression of provisions, which are of use to standardizers. We use the verb shall, the form shall, to express a requirement. So in the sentence, connectors shall conform to the electrical characteristics specified by IEC 60603, that is a requirement. We use should to express a recommendation. So wiring of these connectors should take into account the wire and cable diameter of the cables defined in 61156. So it's a recommendation, it's not a requirement. Another convention which is used very often is that of permission. So we use may to express a permission. So IEC 60512 26100 may be used as an alternative to 27100 for connecting hardware that has previously been qualified to IEC 60603-7. So we're saying that you are permitted to do this. It's not a requirement and it's not even a recommendation. You're given the choice. And finally, can is used to express a possibility. So use of this connector in corrosive atmospheric conditions can lead to failure of the locking mechanism. It's a possibility that we're expressing here, a law of nature, and we're not making any comment about it apart from expressing the fact that it could possibly occur. So these are the basic linguistic conventions that we have. Next thing is normative references. So the normative references clause contains a list of the publications which are cited normatively in the text. Take an example, connectors shall conform to the electrical characteristics specified by IEC 60603-7-1. Because there's a shall before that, it's a requirement. Therefore, this reference is normative, and it should be listed in the normative references clause. On the other hand, if you take a statement like wiring of these connectors should take into account the wire and cable diameter of the cables defined in 61156, there we're giving a recommendation. So this is not normative, it's informative, and we can list this standard in the bibliography. One other aspect linked to normative references is that of dated versus undated normative references. So if you make reference to a specific element of a publication, such as a clause, a subclause, a figure, a table, an annex, etc., you have to date that reference. So to take the example, the dimensions shall be according to table B1 of 60793-250-2012. We're making reference to a specific element, and therefore it has to be dated. The reason why we have this logic is that from one edition to the next of 60793-2-50, the subject matter of table B1 could be totally different. So we have to hone into one specific edition, and the way we do that is by dating the reference. On the other hand, if you've got a very general reference, such as the one I've given here, the test methods of 6130022 shall be used. That's a very general thing. we're making a reference to that standard in general, and it doesn't need to be dated. Right. I also want to mention that only published and publicly available documents shall be cited. Anyone should be able to access these documents, so no drafts, private communications, etc. Right, let's look at terminology now. So, common language and terms are one of the keys to our system. We want to be able to ensure that when we make reference to, when we use a word, it means the same thing from one standard to the next. So before you establish your own terminology, please check whether an acceptable entry already exists and avoid the unnecessary multiplication of terminological variants. We've got two terminology databases, which I've highlighted up here on screen, and you can go and have a look at those and see whether terminology exists for your particular context. And again, well, this is just an illustration of the basic structure of a terminological entry, which you can find in the Directives Part 2. Now, likewise, graphical symbols. Graphical symbols are established by TC3 and its subcommittees, and we encourage you to use internationally standardized symbols from 60617, 60417 and ISO 70000 for graphical symbols for use on equipment, and to prepare circuit diagrams using 61802-1. Please don't go ahead and invent your own graphical symbols if you feel that you need them. TC3 and its subcommittees can come up with new graphical symbols very quickly, so please contact them if you have the need for graphical symbols. Okay, I've more or less come to the stage where I think I should stop now because we are running out of time. I just want to point out a few other useful sources of information. The ISO IEC Directives Part 2 can be downloaded at the address which is given up here on the IEC website under reference material. It exists in both English and French as well as other languages. So you can go and download it there. It's a useful thing to have saved somewhere on your computer, and I hope it will be easy for you to use. Other sources of information, there is a subset of the IEC website which is called Drafting IEC Publications, which gives some guidance, some more general guidance on how to write standards. Please go and have a look at it. We hope that it's useful for you. And lastly, your IEC editor. Each TC has an editor which is linked to that TC, and they're very happy to respond to any questions you might have. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and maybe now if we have a few questions, we could pick some out. Do you have any questions which have been brought to your attention, Rina?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Alistair. So I've received a few questions.
Okay, so let me just scroll through those questions. And I apologize in advance if I can't respond to all of them because of lack of time. But I'll start going through them now. Okay. So someone has asked me, why not date everything? That would be simpler when it comes to normative references. That is a choice that you can make. Some TCs decide to date absolutely all of their references, whether or not they are making reference to very specific things. There are reasons that other TCs decide not to date some of their references. I could take the case, for example, for equipment for use in explosive atmospheres. They will avoid dating their references as much as possible, basically because the whole test setup in the conformity assessment world is very costly for those kind of setups. So there are sometimes economic considerations which mean that people want to keep as much stability over time as possible. And then there's also some people who think that the documents that they are citing will remain fairly stable over time and will always remain relevant. It is a gamble, but that's the choice that people are allowed to make. Okay. Any other questions? Let me have a look. So how do we handle normative references when the reference document is in development simultaneously with the referencing document? I agree that that's very often an issue. So when references are being made, when whole series are being developed together, we often have the problem of referencing being made to documents which don't actually yet exist or haven't yet been published. So it's useful for you to know that you are allowed to cite documents which have reached at least the CDV stage onwards. So anything which is from the CDV stage onwards can be cited. In all honesty, it's a risk if you're making reference to very specific elements of these documents, because as the documents go through a voting process, they could change. Elements which you are making referred to could be struck out. So if you do make reference to documents which are not yet, which are in the process of development, I'd advise you to make references which are as general as possible. Okay, right. I have a comment from Charles Sidebottom. Hello, Chuck. Who says there's a difference between how ISO and IEC applies 16.52 when referencing definitions from another ISO or IEC standard. The ISO view is that the presence of the defined term in a terminology database means that citing the ISO or IEC standard does not create a normative reference. But IEC considers such a citation creates a normative reference. Okay. I agree with you that this does create problems. This impacts document series produced by joint projects. I'm at a bit of a loss to give you a one-size-fits-all answer on this particular one. What I would encourage you to think about is can the user of a standard access that content or not? Is that content accessible to the user, or do they need to buy the standard in order to make reference to it? Is it absolutely indispensable that that standard be used or not? That's the only answer I can give at this particular point. But I get your point that slight differences in practice are annoying, and we do need to iron them out. So people are asking for copies of the presentation. Yes, there certainly will be copies which will be made available to everyone. And I also realize that there's probably a lot of questions which will come up in your minds after the presentation, and feel free to send those questions to me. I don't know if there's any other questions which we have time to deal with at this particular point. So is it possible to make normative references to non-IEC standards, for example, ISO standards? Yes, absolutely. So when you make a normative reference to a document, any document, it is our preference that you make reference to international standards. So IEC standards, ISO standards, ITU, for example. But if no document exists within the IEC or ISO world, you are allowed to make reference to other documents. And it is up to you as the technical committee to judge what is sufficiently authoritative in term for your reference. So Someone has asked me, does Part 2 have preference over lower working group directives? This is an interesting question. We have a number of TCs who come up with their own, how could I put it, set of drafting conventions that they use in their own particular context. I'm fine with these conventions existing as long as they are, fall within the realm of IEC directives. If they run contrary to the ISO IEC directives, that will not be acceptable. So the directives cannot cover absolutely every single subject which exists within our world. We've got 180 technical committees and subcommittees, and the range of subject matter is huge between ISO and IEC, so we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, but the ISO IEC directives is the top-level document and others fit below it. So the documents developed by the TCs do not have precedence. Right.
Okay, so thank you very much, Alistair. We have a few more questions, but we are running out of time now, so I think we will end the webinar. And we have noted your questions, and we will come back to you. And feel free to also send your questions directly to me or to Alistair. So I believe we all go away with a better idea of the principles and rules for the structure and drafting of IEC documents. So thank you, Alistair. Do you have a final word?
Yes. So thank you to everyone for participating today. I realize I've given you a very high-level overview, and I do realize that there are some very specific use cases which you will probably want to bring up with me separately. I'm very happy to field those questions later on, and also I think it's also very important that you talk to your IEC editors who will be able to guide you through the process of drafting standards. And I'd also like to personally thank you, all of you, for your efforts in making the IEC what it is and bringing your knowledge and expertise to the table. It's very valuable, not only for us, but for the whole world. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so thank you again, everybody, for your participation. And as we mentioned, the webinar has been recorded, and I will send you the link as well as the presentation as soon as possible. So thank you again, and goodbye, everybody.